We wanted to talk today about a very common word that's always said on YouTube videos, especially ones about videography and about gear, and that is cinematic.
So what does cinematic actually mean? It's really tough to figure that out because if you look, especially on YouTube, about shooting cinematic video, a lot of people will give you the techniques of how to shoot cinematic. And there are definitely a lot of ways to replicate cinematic video.
So when you look up the word cinematic, it really just means it's like what you see on cinema. However, YouTube now seems to have its own ideas, so what do you think it means?
Well, I agree. I think it's all about replicating the look of a cinematic film that you see on, Hollywood, you see even on TV these days. So, you can look back and be like, there used to be a distinction between Hollywood style movies and TV shows. TV shows would be shot in a different, style, but now you have TV shows like Game of Thrones, like Breaking Bad. You could argue that those are also shot in a cinematic form as well.
And to me, though, when YouTubers talk about it, it actually falls very short of that, because you may get a very good camera, you can shoot in high resolution, you can play with a lot of things, but Hollywood and other movie productions go way beyond that. They shoot with many cameras in the same time. They have a subject, they have directors, and they shoot 7-8 angles, then they cut between these angles in very high frequency. They have a lot of special effects, they have perfect light in every single shot. So that is obviously not feasible to YouTubers.
I don't think it's obviously not feasible. I think that because of the cost of gear coming down and because of all of these YouTube videos that are just showing people how to shoot cinematic, showing people how to use lighting, how to color grade, you can get pretty darn close to shooting like a Hollywood film. And some YouTubers even do make films that have constant camera angles, a lot of cutting, and you can say that their quality is really close to a Hollywood film. The only thing would be they tend to not be as long as a Hollywood film, and they often lack the narrative that a longer Hollywood film would have.
So that is also a very good point. Hollywood movies have a script, and so do many YouTubers, but that is something that a cinema production would always do. They have the phase of pre-production when they script everything, and then every shot is premeditated. And in that case, you can know where you're going to plant your cameras, where your subject and actors are going to be. And that way, you will know you'll get that high quality. But the downside to that, of course, is that it takes a long time, and ultimately it's an expense, because in the case of cinema productions, you have to hire very many people in all of these roles to achieve that quality, and it takes a long time.
Yes, and you compare that to YouTubers, where a lot of times, you can get a crew together, but it's nowhere near what you're getting for a Hollywood film, and it often does come down to budget of no one's paying us necessarily to go out and make these films. I mean, YouTube pays a little bit, but we're not getting, $1 million, billion-dollar budget like some of those big Hollywood blockbuster films do.
Yes, and that is really the big distinction between what people like us do on YouTube. We are a two-person shop, pretty much. We go out, we don't have the time, we have jobs besides this. So what we have to do is get the quality as high as we can with the amount of time and resources that we have, which is quite limited. So let's go over all the things that you can do to make sure that your quality goes up and it starts to resemble something that a professional studio would put out. I guess you always start with a camera. What kind of camera are we talking about?
Yeah, so if you're working on a Hollywood film or just any kind of commercial film, even I was on a commercial film set yesterday, and this guy comes in with this giant camera. It's on his shoulder, and I'm rolling with my little mirrorless camera. And the thing is, today, the mirrorless cameras, you could say, are equivalent or, sometimes even beat out those bigger cameras. But yeah, you don't necessarily need to spend thousands of dollars on a red camera or something like that just to get a cinematic film.
Yes, so you can get that part pretty close, though if you showed up with an X-T3 to make a movie, they'll probably laugh you out of the studio. There's a reason they shoot with those cameras like Arri and the Red and the Black Magic. However, people have shot very good movies with just DSLRs or even GoPros.
Or even iPhones.
Yeah, so that gap has closed to a degree that we don't believe the camera has to be absolutely pro grade.
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I think, when you're shooting films, it matters more about your technique. And technique is all about practice. So it's about whatever camera you have access to practice those techniques over and over again until you get really good at them. And that's really what's going to make the biggest difference in your filmmaking.
That's right. So talking about techniques, one thing that stands out when you watch professionally made media is their lighting is perfect in every single shot.
Yep, you might notice for us right now, like it's bright sun, there's not a cloud in the sky, we're walking, among shaded trees, so our light is probably bouncing all over the place. But in Hollywood films, like, they can have similar conditions to this, but they manage to have that light be even the entire time, which means that there's a lot of people controlling the light.
Exactly. They bring literally truck-sized shipments of lights, and they start controlling the light to the point where they can overpower the sun. Now, we just mentioned cameras. I think that the number one thing that matters actually is not the camera that you shot with, it is the light.
One of many things. I would argue also that sound is very important.
Yeah, so let's go into sound as the next topic.
Sound, again, I was on this little commercial video set yesterday, and you have a camera guy, but you also have one guy whose only job is to do sound. He has to make sure the sound is crisp the whole time. He's listening to it. He's making little adjustments here and there. So sound is super important. And if you look at certain like films or documentaries, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there are some where if you watch the video quality, you can tell it's not the best, but their sound is really good. So I think that that's really important.
The water's bringing down.
You can do it, buddy. You can do it.
You can't hear anything. Trying to find the rope, you're trying to get clipped in.
You can, buddy. You can't do it.
Focus on what you're doing. Be determined, but just prepare yourself that it is a bit crazy in there.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point that you can actually find productions, especially for television and many documentaries, where their shooting is not all that impressive, but there isn't a single time where their sound fails. So you could argue that these professional producers, they actually care for sound more than they care for video.
And it's not just that their sound doesn't fail, it's consistent. Like the quality is just like, it never falters. It's consistent for the entire 30 to 60 to 90 to 120 minutes long. And it's just like, wow. Blows my mind. How do you get sound to be that consistent and accurate?
Yeah, so this really gets into the fact that you have to have a sound engineer, post-production on sound alone. You have to have dedicated sound people in the field to be able to get that consistency, that quality. So once the user or the viewer sits at home, the entire thing has a consistent sound throughout.
But I would say, like on YouTube these days, if you're just making a vlog, sound is obviously important. You need to make sure that people can understand you. You don't have a lot of excessive noise and it's not dropping out, but it doesn't need to be like, audio engineered to the same degree that some of those Hollywood films are.
Well, the good news is that these mics that we're wearing right now, that we've been reviewing a lot lately, actually allow you to be in a variety of situations and still get really high quality sound without having to spend the crazy money and time that Hollywood does.
Yeah, so we can be like right here on the field, we're operating the camera, we've got sound, we obviously can't listen to it, so we don't know if it's being consistently recorded, but we're just trusting the equipment at this point to do its job, which is risky if you're getting paid, but since we're not, you can have that little bit of luxury of not having this, additional sound person here to make sure that all that's going right.
But you brought up a good point that anytime you do a professional production, you actually need sound backup.
Yeah, now that we've started to do some more professional shoots, again, we're not shooting Hollywood films, but anytime someone is paying us to come and make a video, I've started to think about backup sound because I haven't up until this past year.
And you just cannot fail.
Yeah, you can't. Or if you do, you have one soundtrack and you have to figure out how to make it work. So yeah, it's very, very important.
Another thing that you need to be able to do to make movies like Hollywood does is you need to have really fine-grained control over the settings that you shoot with. And that often means the aperture, which gives you control over the depth of field.
So that's when you're talking about like having these prime lenses or really fast lenses that can shoot f2.8, f1.8, things like that. And so when you're able to do that, you get this really like creamy background with a lot of bokeh. And the thing with that is that only certain cameras are able to do that. The GoPro, which we're using right now, is actually not able to do that very well.
Right, so you would, we did say that camera doesn't matter all that much, but it does matter because it needs to be able to at least do things like this. And for that, you will then be cutting a scene which has many different shots. Not all of them are going to be blurred out and everything, but if you analyze how Hollywood does its productions, they have a variety of shots shot at all kinds of different settings, and then they stitch them together, they cut frequently, and then the output is very beautiful because it's made of such shots with high quality and variety.
That's right. And it's really hard to do that if you only have a GoPro with a single wide lens. It, is really great for vlogging. But even when we're out vlogging and doing a travel vlog, this is not a good example right now, but we often have our GoPro as our primary camera, but we also bring our mirrorless cameras with those faster aperture lenses so that we can get similar shots that have a really shallow depth of field.
Yeah, and it also relates to the angle that you're shooting with. For example, you can have a wide angle establishing shots. You then can zoom up on a subject while the subject is telling something intense in a dialogue and things like that. You would always vary between subjects as well during a Hollywood scene. You will never have just one constant in a movie.
So another camera setting that's really important is your color. And you can have a lot more control over that if you choose to shoot in flat. Then you're able to do a lot more post-processing to have more control over the overall color of your resulting video.
And flat is really just a convenience for semi-pro users, while in Hollywood they would shoot things like either raw or log and things like that. So by choosing flat on a GoPro, you're actually kind of using a crutch on this camera to kind of get what they're doing in Hollywood. But the truth is they go way beyond that, and then they give this footage in the hands of a professional color artist, and that is all that person does. If you read the credits in the end, he sat at a desk and he colored everything. And so many people go around the time-consuming part of grading, where they take a raw shot or a log or a flat, and then they apply a LUT, which has been tailored. And LUT really just means lookup table. It turns something A into B. And so if you know what you shot, you can transform it to some other look. And that's really the main cop-out that YouTubers are using to be able to sort of bump up the quality so it goes closer to what Hollywood does. The next thing you hear when you're talking about cinematic is that you should always shoot in 24 frames per second.
You can also shoot in 30 frames per second, but 24 frames per second is deemed to be more cinematic. And so the thing is, once you fix your frame rate like that, the other component to that, if you're following the 180-degree rule, which is what most people do when they're shooting cinematic, is that your shutter speed should be double that of your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 4K 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed needs to be at 1/50th of a second. And if you've ever tried to take like a photo at 1/50th of a second, you can see that it's really kind of a slow shutter speed. So if you have a fast-moving subject, it's probably going to be blurred out. And that's kind of the point of shooting like that.
That exactly is the point. So the reason that you have to be careful about the frame rate is that it's how it makes motion look. And normally when you're just using your eyes, you're out there, they're actually incredibly good cameras is what they are. And your brain is an incredibly good processor. And when you're moving through space and when you're seeing things move at you and so on around you, what you're really seeing is the image that your eyes are being able to get for you. And you see motion in a certain way. So when you do it the way cinema productions do it, it looks good to your eye. It resembles the real world that you're seeing with your eyes.
So if you're shooting at a cinematic frame rate and also having your shutter speed follow that 180-degree rule, is that really feasible when you're making a YouTube video or vlogging? And I would say that no, it's not, because the third part of making the cinematic settings is also having a variable ND filter up front, or just a regular ND filter. And what that does is it allows you to balance out the light around you as you have your fixed settings.
And the issue with that is that you need a person behind the camera at all times to be able to get it right. And it's almost like the sound, where you need a dedicated person. YouTubers are mostly just shooting themselves, and they set the settings, they go on the other side of the camera. They don't really stay there and monitor the whole thing at once to adapt to variable conditions and so on.
And I would say when you're vlogging, it's more important that you're telling a story more so than worrying about your camera settings.
Yeah, so this is a good segue to the wrap up here. You hear people talk about cinematic, and maybe it means one thing to them and something else to others, but it really seems that with the current technology and with all the techniques we mentioned, you can get to a degree towards a better quality. However, you will still be very far off what Hollywood does.
Yeah. I would say that, you know, we're obviously not, but I would also say that the intent isn't necessarily to replicate exactly what Hollywood is doing, because as we mentioned earlier, the other part that Hollywood does, besides the camera settings and all the technical things, is that they've got an actual story. They've got actors, they've got the wardrobe, and, you know, they're trying to make this really long, epic narrative on top of everything else. And we're not really doing that on YouTube.
Well, this though is a great point, is that if you actually wanted your videos to be higher quality, to be seen by more people, to be interesting to them, you would actually invest your time into being interesting, having a story, while you wouldn't spend 12-hour days on set like Hollywood does to shoot and get all this amazing audio and everything else. In the case of YouTube, that actually falls out as a cost, and you focus on engaging people by being interesting more so. So when you think about it, YouTube is actually a lot more similar to the certain creative indie movies that make it big because they're creative and interesting, like the Blair Witch Project or early Quentin Tarantino movies, or there was a Russian movie called Hardcore Henry, shot entirely with GoPro, that looked amazing. And these kind of movies can actually be interesting and still make it to cinemas without having put these giant production budgets forward as a cost.
So can vlogging be cinematic? I think it's arguable, and it really depends on the style, because at this point there are so many different styles of vlogging out there. And so, you know, if you look at, you know, your traditional vlogger who's maybe in a bedroom or just in a static location talking to a camera, they might look cinematic in that they're using the right frame rate, they've got really nice color grading, but it's not really cinematic in that, or it's not really fully cinematic in that it's not a, you know, really visual story.
Yeah, that's the thing, you know, sitting in your room, and that's what YouTubers do because it's easy to control the light and the sound and all that. So when you see them, mostly it looks pretty good, but it's actually one shot. And it's not like they're going through a script and they're telling you a story and they're using many angles and actors and so on. So when it comes to vlogging, it actually probably is the least cinematic thing that you can do.
Yeah, so again, it's partially cinematic. It's not like to say it's not at all cinematic, but it's just lacking the multiple visual angles that accompany the story.
That's right. So when people are trying to tell you, you must blur the background, you must do this and that, you must have a big camera to make your vlogs look cinematic, to us, it doesn't make the most sense, truly. We actually don't buy into that whole idea. We use a GoPro, which cannot do any of those things. So for us, we like to be out in the world and show you the world and tell you how we get through the world and what is interesting about it. We don't stay in a bedroom that we try to make as close to a studio as we can. And this would be impossible really in the field. And when you add on the variable light, the sound and all that, is not very feasible for two people like us to do this, especially in the volumes that we do it in. And we have different ways in which we try to increase the quality of what we do. So it really helps us that there's two of us and each of us can carry a mirrorless camera. And then we have up to 4 lenses at times. So we can do a zoom shot, we can get a wide angle shot, we can do all kinds of things that you couldn't. We can blur the backgrounds and so on. And then we use our GoPro for the narrative. So that is how we do it. And having two people shoot the same subject actually is one of the very important things when you want to do cinematic look.
Yeah, at least 2 people. Again, if you're Hollywood, you'll have multiple people, multiple angles, but for us and, you know, a smaller YouTube production, then 2 angles is definitely better than 1 or none.
So there you have it. This is how we do it. And the last bit piece, these mics have been a huge barrier breaker because now we get sound. It has been very difficult, actually. The sound of all has been the hardest for us.
Yeah, sound again is its own art form in a lot of ways, and it's been the hardest for us to learn. We still have a lot to learn, in fact, but this is definitely helping the fact that the technology is catching up.
All right, some thoughts for you to think about. This was Gemini Connect talking about cinematic, what is it and what it is not.